this two-part series, we are going to learn what I think is the perfect way to cast on for knit one, purl one rib, and bind off for knit one, purl one rib. This is your traditional cast on and a swatch done and knit one, purl one rib. You can see how the cast on is not the same as the ribbing, and the bind off is not the same as the ribbing. So you have three distinct sections here that the eye can discern: the cast on, the ribbing, and the bind off. In what I think is the better way, there are no sections at all, and the only way I can best describe this beautiful method is that this knit one, purl one ribbing just begins out of thin air and melts into thin air, and you don't have any of that tight cast on or bind off that you get with the traditional. It's very, very stretchy, and once you get the hang of it, it's very easy to do. In order to do this cast on, you're going to need 2 strands of yarn. You will put them together with a slip knot over your needle, and the slip knot will not count as a stitch. Now, holding the needle in your right hand, we're going to tension one of the strands of yarn in our left hand, and I tension it this way, but if you have a favorite method, you can certainly use that. The other strand of yarn is going to go around our thumb 2 times counterclockwise. Now, those of you that know how to do long tail cast on, your thumb will intuitively want to go the other way, which is this way. And this is the wrong way. When you do counterclockwise, your thumb swirls around this way, and another way of thinking about it is that the end of your yarn is coming from the outside of your thumb and attached to the needle. This would be the inside of your thumb, and you don't want the yarn to come from there. Now, each one of these maneuvers yields 2 stitches on your needle. We first put the yarn over the needle from front to back, and I like to put my forefinger on it to hold it there. The needle then comes under both strands of your thumb, travels over the top of the forefinger strand, and you knit it through the center of your thumb loops. As you drop your thumb, you will see a loop, and you can see the play of your yarn there. You only need to tighten the thumb yarn. What you now have are 2 beautiful stitches on your needle. Remember, we're not counting the slip knot. The first stitch looks like a yarn over because that's what it was. The second stitch has a beautiful little bead at the bottom of it. Now we'll do another one. I like to keep the yarn over my forefinger at all times and not drop it, because then I can better tell where my thumb yarn has to go. And if you get confused about where the thumb yarn goes, it goes over your forefinger yarn. Can you see that coming from the back? The thumb yarn comes over the forefinger. We now wrap the thumb yarn twice around counterclockwise. Forefinger yarn goes over the needle from front to back. Needle comes under both strands, travels over the strand from your forefinger, and we knit it through the center. We drop our thumb. We tighten only the thumb yarn. Now we have 4 stitches on our needle, not counting the slip knot. And I'll do a few more for you in slow motion so you can get the hang of it. Counterclockwise, over the needle front to back, under both strands, around forefinger strand, and knit it through thumb strands. Tighten only your thumb strand. So each maneuver yields 2 stitches on your needle. And I'm going to just put a couple more on to show you. And then when we come back, I'm going to tell you which ones need to be knit and which ones need to be purl. So this is what your finished stitches on your needle will look like, not counting your slip knot. See those beautiful little beads at the bottom of every other stitch? Those are going to be important for you when you begin your ribbing. Here we are with our completed stitches on the needle, and I just wanted to show you how nice they look all lined up. Here's our slip knot. Remember, 2 stitches were put on for each of the maneuvers. The first one was a yarn over, and the second one was a stitch with a little bead of yarn on the bottom. So it goes in succession: yarn over, stitch with bead, yarn over, stitch with bead. Now this is the right side of your work. So when we turn our work to work the first row, it will be the wrong side row. And we want to have the stitches with the beads become the knit stitches of the rib from the right side. So that means the first stitch from the wrong side we need to purl it. But first we need to clip one of our strands of yarn, and I like to clip the one that's coming sort of in between the first and second stitch here, because we only need one strand to knit with. So I'm just going to clip that, get it away, and now I begin my knitting with the strand of yarn. It's all attached to a ball, and the first stitch is going to be a purl stitch, so I purl that, and then I knit, and then you'll want to tug on this little end to kind of tighten it up, and later you can weave that one in. So I'm just going to go across my 14 stitches, alternating purl, knit, purl, knit. Remember, the stitches that have the bead on them will become the knit stitches when you are looking at the right side of the fabric. So that means from the wrong side of the row, you must purl those stitches with the bead, and you must knit the stitches that look like yarn overs. And we're almost to the end of our row, and then you're probably all wondering, what am I going to do with that big, glumpy, thick slip knot? And before we talk about the slip knot, we have to talk about the last stitch of the row. Because when I turn my work, this will be the right side, and because when I'm going to bind off, I need the first stitch of the bind off to be a knit stitch, this stitch technically is going to appear as a purl stitch from the right side of my work. So what I'm going to do for now is just drop that stitch and drop the slip knot, so that now when I turn my work now begins with a knit stitch, so that I can then begin my bind off. Now if you were working in the round, you certainly wouldn't have to do that. And if you're working in the round, remember then that the right side is always facing you, so that those stitches then with the beads, you would just work as a knit stitch right away in the round. Now I'm going to do a few more rows here, and then when we come back, we can start our bind off. But let me get to the end of this so you can see how beautifully this sets it up in a knit one, purl one rib. And already just after 2 rows, you can see how beautiful that cast on is. And I'm now working on the right side. And we're at the end of our row. And isn't that just the most beautiful knit one, purl one rib you have ever seen? And when we come back, we're going to bind it off. Now that I've worked a few rows in the knit one, purl one pattern, we're ready to start our bind off. This is the right side facing me. Now the directions for this bind off call for your first stitch to be a knit stitch. When I had worked that first wrong side row in the last segment, I had talked about dropping that last stitch before the slip knot. If you want your work to begin with a knit stitch, then you would have had to drop that last stitch before the slip knot. Now there are 3 things to remember about this bind off. Step 1 is that the tapestry needle must come between the first 2 stitches from back to front, and we pull our yarn through. The next step is called knit on, knit off. The on occurs on the second stitch from the tip of the needle, and the off occurs on the first stitch. So we knit on, and we bring our tapestry needle all the way through to the back of the knitting needle. Do not bring your tapestry needle up across the front of the knitting needle, or you will not get the beautiful bind off. It must go through the stitch and all the ways to the back. And if you notice, this second stitch is a purl stitch. So we're going to knit on and pull our yarn through. The second part of the step is knit off, and that occurs on the first stitch from the tip. We put our tapestry needle through it knitwise and drop it off the knitting needle. Still on the tapestry needle, I turn, and we're going to do the third step, which is purl on, purl off. So I'm going through the second stitch for on, purlwise, and if you notice, it's a knit stitch. So we purl on, and now we can pull our yarn through both stitches at the same time. And the last part of the step is purl off, and it occurs on the first stitch on the needle, and it happens to be a purl stitch. So we purl off, drop it off the knitting needle, and pull our yarn through. Now we repeat those 3 steps one more time. Needle comes from back to front between the first 2 stitches. Second step, knit on, knit off. The on occurs on a purl stitch, knit on. The off occurs on a knit stitch, knit off. We turn our tapestry needle to purl position. Step 3, purl on is through a knit stitch. Purl off is through a purl stitch, and we drop it off the needle. And what you're actually doing is you're just sewing those little stitches that look just like you're ribbing. So we do it one more time, but first let's clarify. The knit on occurs on a purl stitch. So if you think of it as the opposite stitch of what the maneuver is, knit on occurs on a purl stitch. Knit off occurs on the same kind of stitch as the maneuver. So knit off occurs on a knit stitch. So we come again, step 1, back to front. We knit on, it's a purl stitch. We knit off, it's a knit stitch. Our third step is purl on. It's the opposite kind of stitch from the maneuver. The maneuver is purl, the stitch is a knit. We purl on. The off is the same kind of stitch as the maneuver. So when we purl off, it's a purl stitch, and we purl off. So here's our 3 steps in rapid succession. Back to front with a tapestry needle. Knit on, knit off, purl on, purl off. It's also a good idea before you begin this to weave in any loose ends, because they always are pesky and they'll get in your way. So here we go again, back to front. Knit on, knit off, purl on, purl off. Repeat, back to front, knit on, knit off, purl on, purl off. Now when we have just 1 stitch left on the needle, we work that as a knit off. And there we are finished. And in order to finish this off nicely, what I do is I turn it around to the back side. I take my end and I run it through that first stitch there. And then I turn it to the front side. And I'm going to duplicate stitch in one of the knit columns. So I come up from the bottom here, and I'm just going to follow this stitch, duplicate stitch over it. And this secures your end in invisibly, and it keeps the stretch, and it will never come out. Then when you're done duplicating over that stitch, turn it to the back side again, and you can weave in your ends any way you like. Some people like to go up and down the rib like this. And there is your beautiful bind off. It follows your columns of rib perfectly. It is stretchy, it is neat, it is beautiful. And I'm going to bet my cameraman's portfolio that you will never, ever go back to the regular conventional cast on and bind off for knit 1, purl 1 rib.